I had been the senior liaison for the Varath delegation for 11 days before I understood what they were actually looking at. Not what they pretended to look at. Not the briefings, the orbital descent, the formal compound walkabout that protocol division scheduled for every survey team, the polished, deliberate display of what Earth chose to show. I mean what they were actually registering in the quiet of their faces when they thought the observation cycle had ended and we had stopped watching. I mean what Fleet Commander Dara Vel was registering every morning when she crossed the outer courtyard to take her survey reading from the compound's south-facing terrace. I had 11 days to watch her do it. I used all of them. My name is Tomas Rail. I have been a senior liaison with the Earth Diplomatic Survey Division for 19 years, posted to the Varath compound for 8 of them, and before that assigned to 3 other first contact postings of considerably less historical weight. I am not a military man. I am not a diplomat in the conventional sense of the word. I do not negotiate trade routes or security frameworks or the terms of military alliances. My work and the work of the 46 people in my division is narrower than that. We receive survey teams. We manage the protocol window. We read the incoming visitor with sufficient care to understand what they are actually registering, as opposed to what they are officially observing, and we use that reading to determine what the conversation should be. It is quiet work. The kind of work that rarely finds its way into histories. Pelavorn's name is in the institutional record because she made a decision that shaped 170 years of what came after. The senior liaisons who held the protocol window during her time are not in the record because their work was the scaffold, not the building. I have made peace with being part of the scaffold. That is the work. But I will tell you about the 11 days, because the 11 days were the building. The Varath Survey Commission had entered Earth's threshold boundary 243 days before that first morning in the courtyard. Their approach vector was old. They had filed it 250,000 years ago, the last time a Varath hull had crossed into our system, and they saw no reason to update it. The approach corridor was not a hostile one. The Varath were not a military civilization, not in the sense we use the word. They were surveyors, classifiers. They cataloged worlds. They had been cataloging worlds since before the first human hand had touched fire, and the methodology they used had not changed in 11 million years because it did not need to. When they filed the return approach 250,000 years ago, filed it, I mean in their own registry, as a scheduled revisit to a notation they had entered as status. Dormant, potential retrieve. They expected to descend on a quiet world. Perhaps a dead one. Perhaps one that had gone through a recovery phase, some new biosphere beginning its long, slow climb. They did not expect what they found when our outer threshold monitoring array lit their approach at 47 light hours and sent the standard intercept package. They expected silence. They received a 2,000-page legal filing and a polite invitation to negotiate the terms of their visit before they crossed the threshold line. That was the first thing. The second thing, which came 3 hours after the filing and long before they had finished reading it, was the observation that 17 of our orbital defense platforms had tracked their fleet to the precise millimeter and were maintaining that lock without aggression, without demand, as a simple statement of fact. Not a threat, a fact. Commander Dara Vel told me much later, on the 9th day, in the small conference annex that smelled of cedar from the old growth screen we had planted along the south wall, the only time she ever spoke to me as one human to another might speak, which is to say without the Survey Commission's formal register. She told me that the lock was the moment the senior survey officers understood something had fundamentally changed in the notation. Not the filing. The filing they could contextualize. Legal documents were within the frame of what they knew civilizations did. But the platform lock, she said, was different. It was too precise. The resolution on the targeting solution exceeded what a civilization at dormant potential status should have been able to produce by 3 orders of magnitude. And every platform was maintaining it simultaneously, without any observable command delay, as if the hemisphere's entire defensive network were a single instrument that had simply opened its eye. She said the senior survey chief, a Varath named Saleth who had served the commission for 400 years, sat with the tracking resolution data for a long time. He did not speak for 18 minutes. Then he said, quietly, in the survey's internal dialect rather than the formal register, that the notation was going to need significant revision. I asked her what the formal classification was. She said, status dormant had been a 5-tier categorization. Earth was now a 6-tier categorization, and the 6th tier had no established precedent in the Commission's 11-million-year catalog. I said nothing. I knew the answer. I had been in this posting for 19 years. I had read the foundational brief the Earth Diplomatic Survey Division gave every liaison on their first week, the one that described in dry procedural language the 234 species the Commission had catalogued over its history, and the 6 civilizations that had ever crossed the threshold into what the Commission's methodology called independent trajectory. 6 in 11 million years. We were the 7th. We were also the only 7th, because the Commission had never encountered a civilization that reached independent trajectory status in a dormancy window, meaning, while the Commission believed them to be inactive, potential, or absent. The Commission had never had to update a dormant notation to a 6th-tier status before. The whole file on Earth, in the Commission's registry, was 250,000 years old. I asked Daravel how long it would take to revise it. She was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the cedar screen. Outside, through the annex's single window, 2 of our atmospheric escort vessels were visible at altitude, triangular, charcoal dark, cruising in slow, lazy arcs above the compound's exclusion boundary without any particular urgency. They were not military craft. They were just the aircraft we happened to have. She said, "We have not finished reading what you filed when we crossed the boundary." She meant the 2,000-page document. She said this without bitterness, without any formal register shift. She said it the way a person says something that is simply true. I had read the document myself, of course, had spent 3 years contributing to its final revision, and another 4 years before that studying its predecessors. I knew it the way you know a thing you have lived inside rather than simply studied. It began with a 400-page institutional history of the Survey Division's work since the notation was found, written in language precise enough to be read as legal testimony and plain enough to be read as a record. The history was followed by the formal classification proposal, the xenolinguistic appendices, the orbital and surface survey data compiled over 230 years, the legal framework for mutual recognition, and finally, sections 78 through 94, which were the forward-looking sections. The ones that described not what humanity had done in the 250,000 years since the notation, but what humanity proposed to do in the time that came after. Section 78 was the one I had written most of, personally. I had revised it 47 times. I had read it aloud in empty rooms and hallways to hear how it sounded. I thought it was, after 19 years of this work, the best sentence I had ever written. It said in full, "We do not request recognition as a completed thing, but as an ongoing one." I told her we could provide additional clarifying materials, if it would help. She looked at me. She had been looking at me differently for 2 days by then. Since the morning on the South Terrace when she had watched the city, the real city, not the compound's maintained perimeter, but the actual metropolitan zone that the terrace faced across 14 kilometers of valley floor, the city that had grown up in the 250,000 years the Commission had been away, the city that from the terrace appeared as a continuous mass of structures in graduated tiers, each tier receding into the morning haze. The uppermost towers catching the sun in surfaces that were not glass and not metal, but something between the two, something that caught light differently than anything she had seen catalogued. On the 7th morning, she had brought her survey instrument to the terrace and taken readings. I had watched her do it, not because I was surveilling her, that was not my function, and the compound's monitoring was discreet, but because she arrived at the same time every morning and I arrived at the same time every morning, for the same reason she did. The South Terrace at dawn, with the city in the distance and the escort arcs overhead, was simply the best place on the compound to understand what you were dealing with. The survey instrument was a remarkable device. It was Varath-made, 11 million years of refinement in a handle the size of a human forearm, and it could read atmospheric composition, population density, structural material analysis, energy output, electromagnetic spectrum usage, and 17 other variables simultaneously to an accuracy the Commission considered useful for preliminary classification work. It was the instrument they used to classify dormant worlds. They used it on planets without atmospheres. They used it on worlds where the largest organism was microbial. She took 3 readings that 7th morning and stood for a long time looking at the instrument's output. I watched her face. She was a Varath of middle professional age, which meant, by Commission reckoning, somewhere around 90 years of field service, though the Commission's standard of field service differed from ours in ways that made direct comparison difficult. She was lean, precise in her movements, with the kind of systematic economy of motion that long instrument work produces in a person. Her posture while reading the output was the same posture she used for everything. Upright, angled slightly toward the data, alert without urgency. On the 3rd reading, the posture changed. Not dramatically. She did not step back. She did not say anything. But she went still in a way that was different from her ordinary working stillness. She held the instrument at the same angle and read the output for considerably longer than the first 2 readings had required. Then she pointed it at the sky and took a 4th reading. I knew what the 4th reading was for. The atmospheric escort vessels, which were not military craft but happened to have certain operational characteristics. The orbital defense network, which from the surface was invisible, there was nothing in the sky that looked like a defense platform, because our platforms did not look the way the Commission expected defense platforms to look. And the 2 deep range sensor arrays embedded in the ionosphere above the compound's exclusion zone, which were not our doing. Those had been up there since before the compound existed, and they were watching the watching, so to speak, with the same quiet patience that everything else was watching with. She turned and looked at me on that 7th morning. I said, "Good morning." She said, "Your energy output exceeds the Commission's baseline for a civilization that has achieved deep space capacity by a factor I cannot currently express with the instrument's existing notation system." I said, "The instrument may need calibration." She said, "I recalibrated it before I came down this morning." I said, "Then perhaps the notation system needs updating." She stood there for a moment. The city caught the dawn light behind her, tier upon tier of it, 250,000 years of it, and she stood in front of it with the survey instrument in her hand and looked at me with an expression I did not yet have a name for. 2 days later, she sat across from me in the Cedar Annex and told me about the platform lock resolution and the 18 silent minutes and the notation that had no precedent. And when I asked her whether the clarifying materials would help, she looked at me with that same expression, which I understood by then, though I still did not have a name for it, and said, "I don't think more materials are the issue." I asked her what the issue was. She said, "We came here to close a notation. We had a status to update, a scheduled revisit to complete, a file to finalize. We've been doing this for 11 million years. It's a methodology. You open the file, you conduct the survey, you update the classification, you transmit to the Commission registry, and you move to the next notation. 234 times. Every notation closes." She paused. She said, I've been taking readings every morning for 7 days. I've conducted 4 formal surveys of the compound perimeter and 2 of the descent zone. I've read the 2,000-page legal filing, not all of it, but enough. I've reviewed the atmospheric data, the energy output, the electromagnetic spectrum distribution, the orbital architecture. I know what the city looks like from the terrace. I know what the escort vessels look like from below, and I know what they actually are. And I've been trying for 7 days to find the notation that closes this file. I said, and she said, there isn't one. The room was quiet. Outside, through the annex window, one of the escort arcs was visible against the pale morning sky. I said, there are 2 more weeks in the scheduled protocol window. She said, I know, I'll use them. And she did. She used them in a way that was, by the end of those 2 weeks, both more and less than what the Commission's methodology called for. She continued her morning readings. She attended every formal session the Protocol Division had scheduled, the materials review, the orbital briefing, the joint survey walk to the threshold marker, where the old Commission's notation had originally been placed, 250,000 years ago, now encased in a preservation housing near the eastern gate, its original survey commission text still legible inside the housing's atmosphere-controlled chamber. She sat through the legal team's walkthrough of the filing. She asked questions that were precise, unhurried, and that demonstrated a depth of preparation I had not expected, not because I underestimated the Varath, but because the questions were not the questions of someone building a case. They were the questions of someone trying to understand a thing that had no category. On the 10th day, she asked me to take her to the threshold marker. It was not on the protocol schedule. It was not irregular. The marker was on the compound grounds accessible, but she asked me personally, not through the Commission's formal channel, and she asked without the formal register. She said, I'd like to go back to the marker, not for the survey, just to look at it. I took her. The marker was in its housing near the eastern gate, where it had been placed 11 years after the Commission's previous visit, when Earth's Survey Division had found the original survey notation during an archival audit and made the decision to preserve rather than remove it. The decision had not been unanimous. There had been voices in the early years for removal, for relocation to a secure research facility where it could be studied without the symbolic weight of public access. Pella Vorn had argued, in the meeting record, that the weight was precisely the point, that a civilization that found its own notation should not hide it in a vault, that the appropriate response to discovering you had been classified was to build a housing, preserve the inscription, and make sure every person who held the Survey Division chair understood what they were looking at when they took the posting. The notation was in High Varath survey script, rendered in the Commission's standard deep impression medium, a clay-like compound that hardened to roughly the consistency of granite over long dormancy periods. 250,000 years of hardening had left it essentially indestructible. The Survey Division had built the housing around it rather than risk damage by moving it. It read, in the translation our xenolinguistics team had filed in the protocol package, Notation 7441 Indigo, System Body, Third Orbital, Class M Biosphere, Pre-Sapient Potential, Dormant Survey. Revisit scheduled. And then a survey date notation in the Commission's calendar system that our team had calculated corresponded, roughly, to a period when the most complex organisms on Earth's surface were our own predecessors, barely upright, barely speaking, not yet certain that fire was a tool rather than simply a disaster. She stood in front of the housing for a long time. She was not reading it. She had read the translation in the protocol package. She was looking at the original notation, the physical artifact of it, the deep impression of the survey script in the hardened compound. She was looking at it the way you look at a thing when you understand its weight. I waited. She said finally, we were here. I said yes. She said, we classified your ancestors as pre-sapient potential. We filed a dormant notation. We left. I said, yes. She said, and you found it. I said, an archival team, yes. About 11 years after we first achieved outer threshold capability. They found the notation in a deep stratum core sample. We identified the medium as artificial. It took our xenolinguistics teams 4 years to achieve a working translation. She turned and looked at me. She said, and then you built this. She was not gesturing at the housing. She was gesturing with a slight motion of her head at everything. The compound, the city on the horizon, the escort arcs, the orbital network, the 2,000-page filing. 11 years in the Commission's eye, 250,000 years of preparation. The entire architecture of what a civilization does when it finds a notation from a survey commission in a core sample and understands, with absolute clarity, what that means. I said we had some time. She looked at me for a moment. Then something happened in her expression that I did not expect. It was not admiration, not in the way the word is usually used. It was not fear. It was something quieter and more complicated. It was the expression of a person who has been doing something for 11 million years and has just encountered, for the first time, the thing that their 11 million years of methodology had no category for. I thought about what to say. I thought about what the protocol division would have said, in the formal register, in the careful language of threshold diplomacy. I thought about the 2,000-page filing and what it represented in terms of human patience and human memory and human institutional architecture, maintained across 250,000 years by people who were not going to be alive to see the return they were preparing for. I said we were not angry. I want you to understand that. Not then and not now. Finding the notation was not the beginning of a grievance. It was the beginning of a preparation. She said, a preparation for what? I said, for this. For the conversation we're having right now in this courtyard in front of this marker. For the protocol window and the filing and the survey sessions. For whatever you decide to transmit to the Commission registry when you leave. We spent 250,000 years making sure that, when your survey team returned, you would find a world that could participate in that conversation on its own terms. She was quiet. I said, we didn't want to be a notation that closes. We wanted to be a notation that changes what the notation system can hold. The cedar screen rustled in the morning air. Through the eastern gate, beyond the preservation housing, I could see the first tier of the city beginning to catch the high sun. She said, I need to think. I said, there are 4 more days in the protocol window. She nodded. She looked at the marker one more time. Then she walked back toward the compound's main building at her usual pace, without hurrying, the survey instrument at her side. I stood in the courtyard for a while and watched the escort arcs. On the 11th day, the Commission's senior survey chief Salath requested a formal consultation with the protocol division. He was a Varath of considerable age, even by Varath standards, 4 centuries of survey work, which meant 4 centuries of open and close, notation and transmit, the clean methodology of a civilization that had never, in 11 million years, encountered an anomaly it could not eventually categorize. He came to the consultation room with 2 deputies and a notation tablet, and he sat across from our protocol director Amma Sell and her team, and he said, in the formal register, precisely, that the Commission had conducted its preliminary survey and wished to discuss the procedural question of classification timing. It was a careful formulation. What it meant was, we need more time and we need to know if you'll give it to us. Director Sell said the protocol division would be glad to extend the window and named a duration. Salath asked if there were conditions attached to the extension. She said there were no conditions. She said the extension was a straightforward logistical accommodation for a survey process that had encountered conditions more complex than the Commission's standard timeline anticipated. Saleth looked at her for a moment. He said, "The Commission has never requested an extension." She said, "We know. We considered that when we were drafting the protocol package. It's in Section 14. He asked her what Section 14 said. She said it said, in brief, that Earth Survey Division had anticipated the Commission might encounter conditions that exceeded its standard classification timeline, and had accordingly built a provision for 3 optional extensions, each of 30 standard days, into the protocol framework, such that the Commission could request them without prejudice, without any implied concession of any kind, purely as a matter of procedural accommodation. He was quiet. She said, "We've been preparing this protocol for a while. We wanted it to be complete." He said, "How long is a while?" She said, "The protocol framework was first drafted approximately 230 years ago. It has been revised continuously since then, in response to updated survey data and evolving xenolinguistic modeling of the Commission's formal register. 230 years of protocol revision, against the backdrop of a 250,000-year preparation." He sat with that. Then he said, in a voice that was very measured, very still, "Your xenolinguistic modeling of the Commission's formal register. You have been modeling our language." She said, "For 178 years, yes. We have a 94% formal register confidence interval." He said, "You modeled our language from the notation." She said, "And from 12 other Commission notations we located in deep stratum cores at various sites across the planet over a 40-year survey program. And from 2 fragmentary signal sequences we intercepted from Commission transmissions in adjacent systems over the past 160 years. He put the notation tablet down. He said very quietly, in the survey's internal dialect rather than the formal register, "You have been reading our mail." Director Sell said, in precisely the survey's internal dialect, "With respect, yes. We needed to know the methodology. It seemed important." He did not speak for a long time. His 2 deputies did not speak either. Director Sell's team waited. He said, finally, back in the formal register, "The Commission accepts the extension." That evening, Daravel came to the South Terrace later than usual. The sun was already low, the city catching it in long horizontal angles that made the upper tiers look briefly like something else, something more ancient than they were, though they were not ancient in any sense that the Commission would have understood. The oldest of those towers had gone up perhaps 40,000 years ago, which was barely a medium-term notation in the Commission's timeline. I was on the terrace with a cup of tea. She came and stood at the railing looking at the city. She said, "Saleth told me about the language modeling." I said, "The morning reading must have surprised the instrument." She said, "The Commission has never been modeled before, in 11 million years. Every civilization we've encountered, 234, none of them had the xenolinguistic development to do it, and none of them had the archival discipline to maintain a covert survey program for 40 years to find additional notation samples." I said, "It was 178 years of modeling. The sample collection took 40 years. We had time to be thorough." She said, "You didn't have to tell us you'd done it." I said, "Section 14 mentions it." She looked at me. I said, "Section 47 is a full annotated index of our modeling methodology, the confidence intervals, the fragmentary signal intercept program, and a sample comparison between the survey's internal dialect and the formal register, with notes on the grammatical distinctions. We didn't want there to be any question about what we'd done and how we'd done it." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because concealment would not have been in the spirit of the conversation we wanted to have." She turned back to the city. A high-altitude vessel was moving through the long evening light at the far edge of the valley, its running lights blinking in a pattern that was not, as it happened, identical to any vessel pattern the Commission's survey instruments recognized. It was something we had developed in the past 60,000 years, after we achieved the atmospheric architecture that allowed for that kind of travel. Everything we had developed in the past 60,000 years was something the Commission's instruments had no reference frame for. She said, "The marker." I said, "What about it?" She said, "When your archival team found it, what was it like, do you know?" I said, "There are records. It was a core sample from a site in the northeastern continental zone. A geological survey team, not a xenolinguistic team. They weren't looking for it. They brought the core up and noticed an anomalous material signature in a layer that should have been natural sediment. They flagged it. The flag went to a materials analysis team. The materials analysis team identified the medium as non-terrestrial and non-geological, which at the time was a classification that had no established protocol. It went up through 4 escalation layers before it reached the survey division, by which point the medium had been examined by 47 researchers, and nobody had yet understood what they were looking at. She was listening carefully. I said, "The survey division director at the time was a woman named Pella Vorn. She is in our institutional history the way certain people end up in institutional history, not because of what she said but because of what she decided. She read the full report. She looked at the notation in the medium. She had the xenolinguistic team begin their analysis. And she opened a file, not a public file. An internal file within the survey division that she titled, and this is in the record, her own terminology titled, The Long Preparation. She did not make a public announcement. This is the part of the record that sometimes gives people pause when they read it. The notation was evidence that another civilization had been in our solar system, that it had found us, classified us, and left a record of doing so. By any measure that a government, a public institution, or a press agency would apply, it was the most significant discovery in human history. Pella Vorn understood this. She also understood that the most significant discovery in human history required the most patient institutional response in human history, and that the two requirements, significance and patience, were fundamentally incompatible with a public announcement in the current moment. A public announcement would have produced immediate reactions, political, scientific, military, theological, all of them understandable, none of them useful for the specific task Pella Vorn had identified, which was, read the notation, understand what it means, understand who left it and what they would want when they came back, then be ready. She funded the xenolinguistic analysis under a budget line that the public record described as deep stratum archival materials processing. She established the geological survey program under a line that described itself as non-terrestrial mineral signature mapping. She was not hiding it, exactly. She was giving it the time it needed to become what it needed to become, before it had to explain itself to people who were not yet equipped to hear the explanation. Dara Vel said nothing. I said, Pella Vorn died before the xenolinguistic analysis was complete, but the file she opened is the direct ancestor of the protocol framework you have in your briefing materials. 170 years of institutional inheritance, director to director, each one maintaining the file, expanding it, revising it, adding new notation samples as the geological survey program found them, adding the signal intercept data as our outer range capacity grew. 230 years of formal protocol revision. Every director who held that chair understood what the file represented. A civilization had been here before us. They had classified us as pre-sapient potential. They had a methodology, and one day they were going to come back. She was very still. I said, Pella Vorn didn't know when. None of the subsequent directors knew when. The Commission's revisit schedule wasn't in the notation. There wasn't enough fragment in the secondary samples to recover a timeline. So the preparation had to be open-ended. It had to be something that could be maintained for 50,000 years or 500,000 years or as long as it took. That's a different kind of institutional problem than most civilizations face. You have to build something that doesn't depend on any individual's lifespan, that outlasts any single government or political era, that remains coherent and purposeful across changes of regime and technology and culture. You have to make the preparation the inheritance. She said, how? I said carefully, we made it part of what it means to be human in the institutional sense. The survey division's long preparation file was the foundation, but foundations aren't enough. You need the structure above them. We built the structure over 170 years, the notation archive, the geological survey program, the xenolinguistic faculty, the signal intercept capacity, the protocol framework. And we made each piece of the structure legible to the next generation of people who would inherit it, so that none of them were starting from nothing. So that each director who opened that file understood, on the first day, exactly what they were holding. She said, and the preparation in the other sense, the orbital architecture, the defense network, the vessels. I said, different directors, different institutions, same inheritance. When we found the notation, we understood, the survey division understood, that we were not the only civilization with reach, that there were others, that space was not empty, and that our development was not unobserved. We didn't know what we would find out there, or what would find us, or when, but we knew it was a matter of time. That knowledge is a different kind of inheritance. It's not just a file, it's a posture, a disposition, the understanding that the universe is populated, and that preparation is not optional. She looked at me. I said, the notation changed what we were, not because it frightened us, not because we resented it, but because it gave us a frame. We knew there had been someone before us. We knew there would be someone after. We knew we were in a history larger than our own. And that knowledge, that single piece of knowledge, from a clay-like notation in a geological core sample, that knowledge shaped 250,000 years of what we decided to become. She was quiet for a long time. She said, I've classified 234 worlds. I've closed 234 notations. I've been doing this for 190 years, and Saleth has been doing it for 400. In all of that time, in all of those worlds, I have never found a notation that I would describe as having done something to the world it was placed on. The notation is a record. It is the Commission's observation. It goes into the registry and it sits there and it waits for the revisit. She paused. She said, your notation didn't sit there and wait. Your notation became part of what you were. I said, yes. She said, we've never had that happen before. I said, I know. She turned back to the city. The sun was down now, the valley floor settling into the soft twilight that this latitude produced in early summer, the city's upper tiers still catching the last horizontal light, the lower tiers already in the blue-gray shadow that preceded full dark. The escort arcs were still overhead, 3 of them visible, their running lights blinking in their unrecognized pattern. She said, what do you want from the Commission? I said, the same thing Pella Vorn wanted when she opened the file, recognition that we are here, that we have been here continuously through everything that happened in the 250,000 years between your notation and your return. That the notation needs updating, not closing, not a final classification that goes into the registry and sits there, but an ongoing notation that reflects an ongoing thing. We are not a world to be catalogued. We are a civilization engaged in a history. We want the Commission to engage with us in that history. She said, that isn't in the Commission's methodology. I said, I know. We put it in Section 78 of the filing anyway. She looked at me. That expression again, the one I had been watching for 11 days, and for which I still did not have quite the right word. She said, you put it in the filing. I said, we put everything in the filing. We wanted there to be a record of what we were asking for, regardless of the Commission's decision. If the Commission reads the file in another 250,000 years, we wanted them to know what the notation said, and what we said in return. She said, "You're thinking about what happens if we leave and don't come back." I said, "We think about all the possibilities. That's part of the preparation." She said, "And if we leave and do come back, in 250,000 years, or 50,000, what do you expect to find?" I said, "We expect to find that we are still here, and that we are still interested in having the conversation." She laughed. It was unexpected, not loud, not performative, just a genuine exhale of something that might have been surprise or might have been something more complicated than that. Then she was quiet again, looking at the city. She said, "I need to transmit my preliminary assessment to the Commission registry before we leave. Standard procedure. Saleth will file the formal classification request with the Commission's Classification Committee, which will take, in standard Commission timeline, between 40 and 80 years to deliberate." I said, "We know." She said, "The preliminary assessment carries my name. It's my professional observation and recommendation. It goes in the record alongside whatever the committee decides." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am going to recommend that the committee authorize a new notation tier." I said, "Nothing." She said, "Not for Earth specifically. As a general methodology update, the Commission should have a notation for a world that was not merely dormant but was aware. That found the notation, understood its implications, and shaped its development accordingly. That's a phenomenon the methodology has no category for. If it happened once, it may happen again. The Commission needs a category." I said, "That will take time to authorize." She said, "I know. The Commission is not fast. 11 million years of methodology revision at the Commission's pace would make a very long bibliography, but the recommendation will be in the record. And if the Classification Committee takes 80 years to deliberate and then another 20 to authorize a new tier, then someone at the Commission will eventually transmit a revised notation to Earth's system. And when they do, it will say something other than dormant. It will say something that is true." I said, "That's what we wanted." She said, "I know." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, 190 years, that's how long I've been doing this work. I came to it because I was good at it, the survey, the analysis, the classification. I was good at being methodical. I was good at the open and close, the clean notation, the file that completes. In 190 years, I have never found a file I couldn't complete." She paused. She said, "I'm going to leave Earth with an open file." I said, "Yes." She said, "It's going to bother me for the rest of my career." I said, "I imagine it might." She said, "I'm going to think about the marker for the rest of my career. The original notation in the hardened medium. The fact that you built the housing around it instead of moving it. The fact that Section 47 of your filing is an annotated index of our internal dialect, assembled from 12 notation fragments and 2 intercepted signal sequences." She said, "You are a very strange civilization." I said, "We had a very clear example to work from." She said, "The notation." I said, 11 million years of Verath methodology in a single clay impression. We understood what a civilization that had been doing something for 11 million years looked like. We wanted to know what the thing they'd been doing was." She said, "And now you know." I said, "We know what we could read in 250,000 years of effort. We know there's much more." She said, "There is." I said, "We know." The last light had gone from the upper tiers. The city was transitioning into its night configuration. Not dark, not what the Commission's survey instrument would have read as dark, because nothing about Earth's night was dark in the way an uninhabited world is dark. The valley floor was lit in tiers, the structured light of 250,000 years of inhabited engineering, steady and unhurried, and above it the escort arcs continued their patient circuits. She said, "I have 2 more days." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'd like to take 1 more reading from the South Terrace tomorrow morning." I said, "I'll be there." She was. She came at the usual time, with the survey instrument, and she took her readings with the same precision she had applied every morning for 11 days, and she stood for a while looking at the city and the sky, and I stood nearby with my tea, and we were quiet in the way that people are quiet when the important things have already been said, and what remains is simply the weight of them. At one point she said, not quite to me, "Your instrument notation system is going to need updating too." I said, "We're aware." She said, "You've already drafted a proposed revision." I said, "Section 92. She made the sound that the survey instrument readings had initially produced in her expression, that exhale, that complicated something. She said, "Of course you have." On the final morning she met me in the Cedar Annex before the formal departure session. She had the notation tablet with her, the Commission's internal notation device, not a piece of survey division equipment but hers personally, the tablet on which she recorded her own observations in the Commission's internal dialect, the private survey log that was hers and not the Commission's registry. She said, "I want to show you something." She turned the tablet so I could read it. It was in the Commission's internal dialect, not the formal register, but the everyday script that we had modeled less thoroughly, the spoken word notation of the survey's day-to-day record. Our modeling of the formal register was at 94% confidence. Our modeling of the internal dialect was at 67%, which was a working literacy rather than a native fluency. But I could read it well enough. It was a single notation. Notation 7441 Indigo, revised. The notation identifier was the same one that was pressed into the hardened medium in the preservation housing near the eastern gate, the same number, the same color code, the same survey sequence. The text she had written read in my reading of it, Class M Biosphere Continuous Sapient Habitation, 250,000-year documented development from initial notation, independent trajectory confirmed, methodology update pending. Revisit, active. Notation status, open. She said, "This is my personal log. It's not the Commission registry. It's not the formal classification. But when I transmit my formal preliminary assessment, the notation will say something like this. It will be in the formal register, and it will be processed through the committee, and it will take the time it takes. But this is the notation. This is what's true." I said, "Active revisit." She said, "Yes." I said, "How long is active revisit in Commission methodology?" She said, "It depends on the file. For a standard notation in the revision queue, 300 to 500 years for the committee to deliberate and respond." I said, "And for a notation that requires a new tier?" She said, "We've never done it before." I said, "So you don't know?" She said, "No." I said, "Neither do we." She looked at the tablet for a moment, then she closed it. She said, "I've been trying to think of what word to use for you. In the survey's language, in the formal register, we have a word for a world that has developed beyond initial notation, beyond the dormant classification, beyond the standard sapient progression tiers. The word roughly translates as the world that changed the registry. It's a theoretical word. The Commission coined it about 3 million years ago, in anticipation of the possibility that a civilization might someday achieve something the methodology could not categorize." She said, "We've never used it before." I said, "And now?" She said, "And now I'm going to use it in a preliminary assessment." She put the tablet in her carry case. She picked up the case. She looked at me. She said, "I want to ask you something before I leave." I said, "Yes." She said, "Pella Vorn, the director who opened the file, was she afraid?" I thought about it. I thought about the institutional record, the annotated history of the survey division's long preparation, the notes that successive directors had appended to the original file as it passed from hand to hand across 170 years. I thought about the first notation Pella Vorn had made in her own handwriting at the top of the file, which was still there in the archive, preserved in the same careful way we had preserved the Commission's original notation. Her first notation had read, "We are not the first, we will not be the last, we will be ready." I said no, she was not afraid. Daravel nodded. She said, "I'll transmit the preliminary assessment when we reach the threshold boundary." I said, "We'll be listening." She said, "I know." She left the cedar annex. I sat for a while in the quiet, the cedar smell, the morning light coming through the single window. Then I walked to the south terrace and watched the Commission's departure shuttle lift from the compound's landing zone, a clean, quiet ascent in the early light, the vessel rising through the escort ark's patient circuits without any ceremony, without any particular urgency, ascending steadily through the layers of what Earth's sky now contained. I watched it until it was a point of light above the city's upper tiers, and then smaller than that, and then gone. 47 hours later, at the outer threshold boundary of our system, the Commission's fleet transmitted its standard departure acknowledgement to our monitoring array. It was in the formal register. It concluded, as the Commission's formal register always concludes departure acknowledgments, in a fixed phrase 11 million years old, with the notation, "Survey Commission Transit Outbound, next scheduled return to be filed." And then, below that fixed phrase, in a formulation that was not part of the standard departure acknowledgement protocol, not part of any standard Commission communication format in our 178 years of formal register modeling, not a phrase we had any record of the Commission transmitting to any world in the 11 million year catalog. Notation 7441 Indigo, revised, active revisit, we will return. I read the transmission in the monitoring room with Director Cell and the protocol team. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Director Cell picked up her notation tablet and opened the Survey Division's long preparation file. The same file Pella Vorn had opened 170 years ago, the one that had passed through 17 directors' hands, the one that was the foundation and the inheritance and the reason for the 11 days in the Cedar Annex. She scrolled to the bottom. She added a new notation. It said preparation complete, active revisit filed, file status ongoing. She put the tablet down. Outside the monitoring room's high window, the city caught the morning light in its graduated tiers, patient and unhurried, the way it had been catching the morning light for 250,000 years. Pella Vorn had been right about most things. She had been right that we would be ready when they came. She had been right that the preparation was the inheritance, and that each generation would carry it forward without losing it. She had been right that the notation in the hardened medium was not a thing to be afraid of, but a frame for understanding what a civilization could become if it chose, with clear eyes and long patience to become it. She had not been right about everything. She could not have predicted that the Commission's survey commander would come back from the South Terrace on the 7th morning with the survey instrument and an expression for which there is no precise word in either language. She could not have predicted the Cedar Annex, or the conversation by the threshold marker, or the informal notation in the Commission's internal dialect on a personal log tablet that was not a formal record, but was, in the way that personal things sometimes are, the truest record of what had actually happened. She could not have predicted we will return in a transmission format the Commission had never used before. But she had been right about the most important thing. She had been right that we were not the end of a notation. We were the beginning of one. That was what Daravel had seen. Across 11 days of morning readings and formal sessions and quiet conversations in the Cedar Annex, standing in front of the preserved marker with the city in the distance and the escort arcs overhead. That was what the 6th-tier notation contained, if the classification committee ever found the language for it. We were here, we had been here through everything. We were going to keep being here. The long preparation was over. The long conversation had begun. That was enough.